due to the resumption of American fire support with HIMARS that the Russian rate of advance in Kursk slowed down so much. The Russian advance in Pokrovsk has slowed down significantly. The Ukrainians are conducting counterattacks and alleviating pressure from there. The Ukrainians have also engaged in some very interesting counterattacks in Toretsk in the east. In the south, the Russians have been putting on some more pressure. They've been trying to advance near the Kakhovka Reservoir, near Kamensk. So the lines are shifting in sort of small-scale, tactical sorts of ways. The battlefield is still predominantly positional, but there are clearly opportunities. I mean, the last year has been spent talking about the collapse of Ukrainian lines around Pokrovsk and rapid Russian advances and all of these things, and that clearly didn't come to happen.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio. I'm Louis Sykes. Today we're joined by George Barros, head of the Russia team at the Institute for the Study of War, which is a go-to source for regular updates on global conflict and a well-regarded authority on the war in Ukraine. George, thank you for joining us.
Hey Louis, thanks for having me once again. Good to see you.
George, Ukrainian and Russian teams will start indirect talks on Monday. What do we know of the position each side has taken and where they are so far?
Sure. I suppose the bottom line up front is that the Ukrainians have offered to make a series of concessions, largely facilitated by pressure from Washington, whereas the Russians have been quite intransigent about their negotiating positions, and Moscow has refused to back down one iota from its maximalist goals. To just lay it out concretely, the Russians, as a precondition to even just have talks, they seek to have full control over not only just Crimea and that being legally recognized as Russian territory, but also 4 Ukrainian provinces in eastern and southern Ukraine, none of which the Russians entirely control, and none of which the Russians are likely to actually seize through warfighting for at least another several years. On the other hand, the Ukrainians, they've offered simple, unconditional 30-day ceasefire. In general, in the theater, they've offered a moratorium on strikes and warfare in the naval domain, as well as for the long-range air and missile campaign strikes, which the Russians refused. The Ukrainians have signaled their willingness to accept temporary territorial concessions, that is, accept essentially that their territory is occupied but not legally recognize it as Russian in order to talk and discuss the future of those territories. But the Russians aren't willing to back down. So I think that's sort of the state of the diplomatic state of play. I don't see the Russians being very likely to back down. I don't think the Ukrainians can really concede very much more. And I think the American facilitators will have, they might come to a head, and there's going to be some difficult decisions that Washington's going to have to make vis-a-vis if we're going to try to get peace at all costs, which side is going to have to ultimately make really painful concessions.
And they use this term indirect talks, and we're talking a lot about American facilitators. I mean, what exactly does that mean? We're not then going to have Ukrainian and Russian negotiators sitting down face to face necessarily. That's
correct. So this will be shuttle diplomacy. So essentially what they're going to do is they're going to sit the Ukrainian party in one room, and then they'll sit the Russian party in a different room, and you'll have Americans that will be running from room to room to convey messages. And this is a form of negotiations that you use when it's very difficult to be able to get the principals in the same place to have the discussion themselves. So it helps breach some of the discomfort in that forum.
And there is, I mean, you've just said it there, I believe, but there is no sign that the Russians are really retreating from those maximalist aims that they've already laid out.
That's correct. And frankly, the Russians keep signaling their intent to go for even more territory, even beyond the 4 regions that they have formally and legally annexed. Well, illegally, but legally, formally, according to Russian law, they claim are annexed. The Russians and senior Kremlin officials continuously keep referring to this concept of Novorossiya, or New Russia, which is actually quite geographically large. It includes other other Ukrainian provinces like Mykolaiv and Odessa, Dnipropetrovsk Oblast. So their objectives are much higher. And of course, the thing that we're very concerned about is, look, if we manage to get some sort of armistice or ceasefire, if there isn't a robust security guarantee and if there isn't an enforcement mechanism, then this whole endeavor the Russian endeavor from the Russian perspective would have been more or less a success, and Putin will only be emboldened to, at a place and time of his choosing, to go back in and finish the job.
I want to come back to what some of those security guarantees might be, but in the first instance, this idea of the short-term ceasefire, it still seems to be being floated by Ukraine and the US. The Russians keep seemingly rebuffing it. Are there any signs on the ground, at least, that attacks are slowing, or the infrastructure attacks may have stopped, or that even preparations for that are going on either side?
Thanks for asking the question. It's a very important question. Let me be crystal clear. There is no ceasefire yet. Both, the Russians, the Ukrainians, and the Americans, we've talked about the ceasefire and the 30-day ceasefire and a moratorium on strikes. But talking about it and then actually sitting down at the table and signing it and agreeing to it has not actually happened. And I would note that the Russians are falsely claiming that the Ukrainians are currently violating the terms of the ceasefire when the Ukrainians are conducting their strikes into Russia or continuing combat operations. The Russians are doing that too against the Ukrainians. And they're basically framing every single Ukrainian strike into Russia as a violation of a ceasefire that formally doesn't exist yet. And so the Russians are already trying to pollute the information space, pollute people's perceptions of Ukraine as being a spoiler. And I think it's a very clear indicator of where sort of the Russian strategy and head game is with all of this. In terms of the kinetic of stuff on the battlefield and across the region, no, there's been no signs of fighting slowing. The combat's it's following the same patterns as it has been for the past several days. Just yesterday, the Russians conducted strikes against Odessa, and the Ukrainians conducted strikes against, just 2 days ago, against Russia's significant strategic air base and the Engels 2 air base in Saratov Oblast. So they're still going at it.
Yeah, certainly, as you say, the air campaign overall has not halted in any way. What more can you tell us about that strike on Engels Air Base earlier this week?
Sure. So we published about this yesterday. We collected some satellite imagery from one of our technology partners, Maxar. It's a satellite company. And what we see is that the strike successfully destroyed significant ammunition warehouses and depots located to the northeast of the airfield. There's some fairly large craters and burn marks and damages. So you can see sort of the before and after damage shots of what the Ukrainians took out. The airfield itself is still operable, it seems. I've not seen any evidence that the Ukrainians took out any of the bombers, but they certainly hit a significant amount of material. And you look, an airfield is only effective and so far as you have the maintainers there, you actually have the ammunition, the fuel. So if the Ukrainians can cripple the infrastructure on the airfield, the strip and the planes really they're not going to be able to fly sorties if the maintainers and the reloads and all that stuff is gone. So I'm not prepared to provide a comprehensive assessment, though, of to what extent the airfield has been degraded. But it's a good hit, and hope to see more like it.
And presumably that suggests that despite the stoppage in US intelligence provision, the Ukrainians are still, either because of the resumption of that or through their own means, they're still able to conduct these long-range strikes that we'd seen a lot over summer, for example.
That's right. This was not necessarily dynamic targeting. So dynamic targeting being you're tracking a moving object, a moving target. The airfield is a static object. I mean, it doesn't move. The warehouses and the depots that were struck don't move. There's some intelligence information that could be helpful to know, like, hey, on the schedule, are the warehouses full of stuff, or are they empty? How's the things transitioning through it? But striking these stationary targets that don't particularly require dynamic targeting data and intelligence sharing, the Ukrainians are able to do by themselves perfectly just fine.
And the strikes that Ukraine have been carrying out into Russia, like you say, Russia are claiming these are all violations of a ceasefire that they don't seem to have agreed to yet. At the heart of that are things like Sudza gas distribution station. Even Zaporizhzhia appears to now be playing a role in Russia's narrative around this. What can you tell us about how they've constructed that and what role these areas play?
Sure. Well, the number one thing I would say is that the Russians are framing all Ukrainian operations, all the normal things that have been happening, over the course of this combat. Now that we've injected the narrative of there's now a ceasefire on the cards, but it's not yet been officiated or signed or implemented. The Russians are already preemptively, essentially framing every Ukrainian strike, every Ukrainian attack as those dastardly Ukrainians are once again violating the terms. They are unreasonable, as opposed to us decent, rational, normal Russians. And that's just not true, because it is normal in warfare that up until the minute that the ceasefire actually takes effect, you keep fighting. And the Russians are doing that too. I mean, they're attempting to do land grabs in southern Ukraine and Zaporizhia as well. And so really it's a mass scale psychological and media manipulation to try to paint Ukraine as the aggressor when it's actually, in fact, the Russians who are the aggressor. Now, they're also trying to do this in terms of the substance. I would note that following Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump's phone call from earlier last week, the American readouts of their conversation differed from the Russian Kremlin readouts of their conversation. The American readouts state that the Russians and the Ukrainians should engage in a ceasefire for, once they agree to it, on a moratorium of strikes of energy and infrastructure, civilian infrastructure specifically. The Russian readout simply says energy infrastructure. And then the Ukrainians, with their understanding, they said also energy and civilian infrastructure. The Russians are just saying energy infrastructure. And so one of two things are happening. It's either Putin told Trump something in the phone call and now is publicly signaling something otherwise, or there's been some miscommunication, there's been an impasse, and there's a disagreement on the terms. Suffice it to say, the Russians might be trying to say that they're justified in striking Ukrainian civilian infrastructure or other infrastructure, whereas the Ukrainians are only allowed to, they shouldn't strike either civilian or dual use or energy infrastructure. And so they're trying to pollute and muddy the waters that way too. And a lot of the ways that they're trying to apply the rules to are also just complete non sequiturs, though. There's been talk about the ceasefire and all this stuff in the context of the Saratov Engels 2 air base, which none of this applies to, because Engels 2 air base is a military target and not covered by the ceasefire in any event, because it is neither civilian infrastructure nor energy infrastructure. So to talk about the ceasefire in the context of a military object is sort of like, the apropos of nothing. But the fact that the Russians are investing so much effort in trying to muddy the waters and obfuscate the substance of the issues really just demonstrates the extent to which they are really trying to manipulate this whole situation.
And is that getting them anywhere? I mean, is this a strategy, or are they kind of scrabbling to find things here that they can take as a win from some sort of agreement now with Donald Trump?
I think it's a strategy, because what they're trying to do is create this larger narrative of reasonable, good Russians, bellicose, unreasonable, uncontrollable Ukrainians. And the more you say it, the more people it resonates with, even though it's not true. And this is especially true when you have policymakers, American policymakers and negotiators, who demonstrate through their own words and actions that actually they're willing to take the Russian version of accounts at face value rather uncritically, even when it's known to be exaggerations or falsehoods. So in that sense, it's part of a cogent strategy to fundamentally shift our perception of reality. And you only make as good of a decisions, you only make as good of policies as you properly understand and perceive reality.
And elsewhere in Europe, Kiev's continental allies have been moving ahead with meetings on a peacekeeping or reassurance force for Ukraine. How feasible does that look right now, if fighting's still going on in Ukraine?
I'm not an expert in ceasefire implementation, but normally, we'll go back to the military history. You normally fight, both sides fight up until the point in which the ceasefire is actually implemented. So that is to be expected. Continue fighting should not necessarily be a rate determiner for you actually having, the parallel process of developing the peacekeeping force and the plans and all those things. Now, What I'll say is this: I think we're heading towards an impasse on the peacekeeping issue, because it's very clear that there's going to have to be, if we're going to have a ceasefire and a protracted peace, then there's going to have to be some sort of enforcement mechanism and monitoring mechanism to ensure that the ceasefire is honored. And that will require some presence on the ground. And ideally, you would want to have some sort of security guarantee for the Ukrainians, a deterrence force. That's where the European boots on the ground, planes in the sky, come into the picture. That said, going back to the earlier part of our discussion, when we talk about Russian intransigence and their demands, on the list of their demands is absolutely no foreign peacekeepers in Ukraine whatsoever. So, one of two things is true. It's either that the Russian demands are that they publicly articulate are false, and that in reality, in these closed-door discussions, they are actually okay with there being peacekeepers in Ukraine, which I think is personally very unlikely. Or we have a parallel process, and the Russians are going to decisively reject any sort of proposal that involves having European peacekeepers in Ukraine, and it's going to force parties to make big concessions, or there's going to be a massive disagreement on this issue, which makes the likelihood of a ceasefire and a negotiated settlement and any of this sort of stuff very likely to fall through. I think the latter is more likely, to be honest.
British Prime Minister Keir Starmer has suggested that this reassurance force could instead be a sea and air force. I mean, is that less messy to set up that way if they're not physically on the ground, or are the Russians really just not looking like they're going to mince words here?
They're not going to mince words. They're not going to accept sea. They're not going to accept planes in the sky. And then from a practicality standpoint, I would insist on having a ground force on the land as a deterrence force, because unless there's skin in the game, and the Western states that decide to constitute the deterrence for Ukraine so that Russia does not go into this again and violate the ceasefire again. Need I remind the readers and the listeners that there was two ceasefires in place. There was Minsk 1 in 2014. There was Minsk 2 in 2015. And then Putin violated Minsk 2 again in 2022 with the full-scale invasion. So this whole, the establishment of weak, toothless ceasefires, which then the Russians violate at their leisure, is like a very common pattern in this conflict. And so the lesson learned that we must not repeat, the mistake we must not repeat, is another meaningless, toothless ceasefire with no enforcement mechanism, so the Russians can simply violate it at their leisure. You need to have boots on the ground to be that deterrence force. And so I don't think, planes and naval stuff, that's not going to be sufficient. A necessary component, but insufficient by itself.
We're speaking about, foreign military support here. On the other side of that, there is still this issue of North Korea, isn't there? The Trump administration has issued a sort of warning to Russia over their cooperation with North Korea. Could that play into negotiations at all? Where are we on this issue of Russia and the DPRK?
We're not tracking a whole lot of significant changes in the relationship. The DPRK sends a tremendous amount of material to the Russians. Somewhere in the order of between 40 to 60% of the shells that are fired from the Russian side against Ukraine are sourced from North Korea. The North Koreans sent about a division's worth of infantry, so we're talking 11 to 12,000 troops. That was back in fall 24. We've not tracked another additional deployment since then, though it's certainly possible. We have North Korean workers working in Russian factories to help keep the Russian war effort going and address parts of the Russian labor shortage. And of course, the North Koreans are also sending ballistic missiles and self-propelled howitzers and a variety of other heavy equipment. But the dynamics and the fundamentals of the relationship have not changed. Now, this is a good opportunity to discuss the non-starter elements of the Russian demands for the peace talks. I would note that when President Trump very cleanly and plainly went to Putin and said, we have a 30-day general unconditional ceasefire, will you accept it? Putin said no. He said the Ukrainians must not be rearmed and they must not do any mobilization and force generation during this period. But it's no rearmament for thee, but yes for me. Putin did not have any stipulation on, but I can't continue receiving ammunition from North Korea, but I can't keep getting drones from Iran, right? So I just feel like when we're talking about all these measures and various other things, and then looking at what the Russian demand points are, it really just shows that it's a series of Western and American and Ukrainian concessions where the Russians continue making these demands, and so far we've kind of just been lining them up. And it begs the question: at what point are we actually going to realize that, okay, we can try? You can take the horse to the water, but you can't make it drink. The Russians are really not. This is not a surprise for me because it's what we've been assessing for a long time, but we've tried to convince the policymakers that it is the Russians who are the problem, right? They want to keep doing conquest, and it is evident in their interactions with you directly. It's evident in their actions. It's evident in their statements.
And we've been talking a lot about the negotiations today. Where does all of that leave Ukraine and Russia on the ground across that front line now?
Interesting things are happening on the front line. So, the Ukrainians are being pushed out of Kursk. They're still there. They'll probably complete their withdrawal within the next coming days. I'm honestly surprised that they've held out as long as they have. It's due to the resumption of American fire support with HIMARS that the Russian rate of advance in Kursk slowed down so much. The Russian advance in Pokrovsk has slowed down significantly. The Ukrainians are conducting counterattacks and alleviating pressure from there. The Ukrainians have also engaged in some very interesting counterattacks in Toretsk in the east. In the south, the Russians have been putting on some more pressure. They've been trying to advance near the Kakhovka Reservoir, near Kamensk. So the lines are shifting in sort of small scale, tactical sorts of ways. The battlefield is still predominantly positional, but there are clearly opportunities. I mean, the last year has been spent talking about the collapse of Ukrainian lines around Pokrovsk and rapid Russian advances and all of these things, and that clearly didn't come to happen. It's clear that Pokrovsk will likely live throughout, make it at least to summer 25. The lines didn't collapse. There was no major breakthrough, and there's actually some opportunities here for Ukrainian counteroffensive. And what I'll say is, it's a real damn shame that we've occupied ourselves with discussing how do we tee up a series of concessions to Russia to bring them to a ceasefire that they're likely just going to violate anyway, as opposed to the Ukrainians soldiered through. There are weaknesses and opportunities for exploitation. How do we provision the Ukrainians so that they can actually impose some costs and put some punches into the Russians to weaken the Russian negotiating position and coerce the Russians into making concessions? I think our thinking about this issue has been entirely backwards.
And so is there still time then, while these negotiations are effectively dragged out, for Ukraine to launch any sort of counter operation anywhere in the Donbass?
So I don't know if I would use the word operation. That implies a campaign, operational level of war. Counterattacks, tactical level of war, absolutely. And we see the Ukrainians doing that now. I mean, there's Shevchenko. There's these are villages in Ukraine where the Ukrainians have been doing counterattacks recently. But there's Shevchenko. There's Uspanivka near Pokrovsk. There's Lysivka. There's this sort of protrusion, the salient that the Russians created in their rapid push out towards Pokrovsk, and the Ukrainians are now attacking the western and the northern sides of that protrusion. They're not heavily fortified positions. They're not the sorts of places where the Russians have had the leisure sitting on it for months and months to be able to dig trenches. So it's territory that's relatively easier to change hands. Absolutely. I think there's a lot of opportunity for tactical counterattacks there. Now, of course, cutting off aid, which changes Ukrainian planning assumptions about what their Ukrainian burn rates can be, cutting intelligence sharing, right? All of these things actually hurt military planning. They hurt troop morale. They hurt your performance. And so we really shouldn't be in the business of eroding Ukraine. We should be in the business of trying to prop them up and make them as, strongman them as much as possible, and simultaneously erode the Russians. Washington's pulled so many levers to try to cajole Ukraine into doing a variety of things. We've pulled no levers against Russia so far. And I frankly don't agree with that approach.
And just finally, George, as I appreciate we haven't got too much time left, how closely should we watch these attacks into Belgorod that we're hearing of following the shrinking of the Kursk salient?
Yeah, candidly, I don't understand what the Ukrainians are doing there quite yet. It's a small scale attack. It's significantly smaller than what the Ukrainians went into to Kursk about. Um, there's a there's a couple hypotheses that I'm thinking about, but my initial reaction is I don't expect that to go very far or for it to achieve anything extremely operationally consequential. Perhaps it could be designed to help uh, the existing Ukrainian forces in Kursk finish their withdrawal in better order than they otherwise would. But I'm still trying to figure out what exactly is going on there. But it's not as big or consequential as the Kursk operation for sure.
Mhm. Well, George Barros from the Institute for the Study of War, thank you very much for joining us today on Frontline.
Thanks for having me, Louis. Always a pleasure.
You've been watching Frontline for Times Radio with me, Louis Sykes. If you'd like to be the first to get exclusive content, you can sign up for membership with the link below. You can also listen to Times Radio for the latest news and analysis, or read it on thetimes.com. Thanks for watching. Goodbye.